Here, take this. It will help warm you up.
Thank you so much.
Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm really hoping to break through the magical barrier of 1,000 subscribers. That number holds a special significance for me. Hit that subscribe button. It's just one click. But for me, it's a huge boost of motivation to create my next video. Thank you in advance. The millionaire's wife left him after he lost everything. The cleaner he'd helped 10 years ago appeared on this rainy night. You're a failure, Rodrigo. You always were. Money just hid it from yourself. Those were the last words Valentina Iturriaga spoke to her husband before slamming the penthouse door with a thud so sharp, so calculated, it sounded less like a goodbye and more like a verdict. Rodrigo Castellanos stood frozen in the middle of the white marble hall, a hall he'd designed himself, paid for himself, filled with art and light himself. He heard his wife's heels receding down the corridor, with the same indifference one might feel leaving a roadside motel. He was 45. Exactly 16 hours ago, he'd been the CEO of the Castellanos Group, one of the most powerful construction and infrastructure conglomerates in the country's central region. He had 3,000 employees, federal government contracts, a fleet of corporate helicopters, and a Swiss bank account sleeping with 9 zeros. He had a beautiful wife, a schedule packed with dinners with ministers, and a reputation built brick by brick over 20 years of relentless work. And now, he had nothing. The collapse had begun 48 hours earlier, when bank auditors called at 6 a.m. with a voice that left no room for optimistic interpretations. The group's accounts were empty, not in the red, not a technical deficit, just empty, as if someone had opened the vault and let every last cent drain out with the methodical patience of someone who knows every key, every lock, every password in the system. Rodrigo's partner, Esteban Fuerte, hadn't shown up at the office that day, nor the next. His phone had gone straight to voicemail since 5 a.m. His personal assistant had resigned via text message, and the corporate lawyer, a man Rodrigo had treated like family for 12 years, had sent a brief, cold, professional email stating he could no longer represent him due to unforeseen conflicts of interest. Rodrigo had spent those 48 hours in emergency meetings, calls with banks, conversations with external lawyers, trying to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. And what he understood, layer by layer, like peeling an onion with raw hands, was that this wasn't an accounting error, nor a bad investment, nor a liquidity crisis. This was a systematic betrayal, planned years in advance, executed with surgical precision that could only have come from someone who knew him inside out. At 11 p.m. on the second day, as the external lawyers also began to distance themselves and the bank started talking about precautionary seizures, Rodrigo arrived at the penthouse and found Valentina sitting on the sofa, a glass of white wine in her hand, a closed Louis Vuitton suitcase by the door. She didn't cry, didn't ask what had happened, didn't say, "I'm here, we'll figure this out together," or any of those phrases one imagines a wife would utter when the world is crumbling. She simply took a long sip of wine. She looked him up and down with that calm that Rodrigo had always mistaken for elegance, and which tonight revealed itself as what it always had been, perfectly rehearsed indifference. "I'm going to my mother's," she said. "Don't call me, Valentina," he started. "No, Rodrigo," she interrupted, placing her glass on the glass table with a delicacy that was more infuriating than any slammed door. "I didn't marry a ruined man. That wasn't in the deal. We've been married for 14 years, and they were good years, but they're over." It was then that she uttered that phrase, the phrase that would haunt him for weeks, that would echo in his head in the quietest and loudest moments, that would wake him at 3 a.m. with the same brutality as a bucket of ice water. "You're a failure, Rodrigo. You always were. Money just hid it from yourself." And she left. Rodrigo stood in the living room for I don't know how long. The penthouse smelled of her perfume. Chanel No. 5, the same one since they met. And that scent now felt unbearable, like forensic evidence of everything that had been a lie. He sat on the sofa, got up, walked to the window, and looked at the city at night, the city he had helped build, literally and figuratively, with his cranes, his contracts, his money. And he felt something he hadn't felt since he was 20 years old, sleeping in a leaky rooftop room with a 2-burner stove. He felt like he belonged nowhere. He picked up his jacket, the same one he'd worn to the emergency meetings, now rumpled, stripped of the authority its Italian cut usually lent him, and left. He had no plan, no destination, only the animal need to walk, to put distance between himself and this penthouse that was no longer his, because the bank would probably repossess it before dawn. Outside it was raining. Not a polite city drizzle, but a dense, insistent rain, the kind that soaks your shoes before you even have time to react. Rodrigo walked without an umbrella, without direction, without hurrying. The water hit his face, and he let it, because the physical cold was easier to bear than the cold within. He crossed avenues he knew by heart. He had signed paving contracts on some of them, and without intending to, he found himself at a small park about 10 blocks from the penthouse. It was a modest neighborhood park, with green-painted iron benches and a couple of yellow streetlights battling the darkness with little success. Under normal circumstances, Rodrigo Castellanos would never have set foot in this park. Under normal circumstances, Rodrigo Castellanos traveled in an armored Suburban with a chauffeur. But normal circumstances had ceased to exist 48 hours ago. He sat on one of the wet benches. His black suit immediately absorbed the water. He didn't care. He rested his elbows on his knees, buried his face in his hands, and stayed there, listening to the rain, feeling the weight of everything. The company, the fraud, Valentina, the 14 years, the 20 years of work, the reputation, the future, crashing down on him like a nameless slab that nevertheless crushed him. He didn't cry, not yet. Men like Rodrigo Castellanos learned from a young age that crying was a luxury the world didn't forgive. So he simply sat there, broken inside and drenched outside, on a park bench at midnight, being nobody. It was then that he heard wheels on the wet pavement. The sound was small, squeaky, the sound of metal wheels that needed oil and yet moved forward with determination. Rodrigo looked up and saw, emerging from between the streetlights with the naturalness of something that had always been there, a stainless steel food cart. It was modest but clean, with a small gas burner lit beneath a tray holding tamales wrapped in corn husks, and a pewter pot of steaming atole. Yellow fairy lights, the kind you see at market stalls and never know how they're held up, hung from the structure, giving the cart an almost living, warm appearance. Absurdly out of place on this night of rain and ruin. And behind the cart was a woman, 30-something, perhaps 37, with dark hair pulled into a bun that the rain had begun to loosen, tanned skin, large brown eyes, a white apron over a floral blouse that the water had darkened on her shoulders. She was petite, but she moved with the quiet energy of someone accustomed to effort and no longer registering it as such. She pushed the cart with both hands, humming something Rodrigo couldn't quite identify. An old bolero, perhaps, her voice low, as if singing to herself and no one else. When she saw him sitting on the bench, the woman stopped, looked at him, and in that moment, something strange happened. She recognized him. Rodrigo saw it clearly, that small startle in her eyes, that fraction of a second when her body betrayed what her mind was still processing. Although he, for his part, had no idea who she was. The woman quickly recovered, brought the cart a few meters from the bench, and without asking, without announcing herself, served a thick, cinnamon-colored liquid in a styrofoam cup, steam rising in white spirals against the cold air. She placed it on the edge of the tray, took 2 tamales with a napkin, and set them beside the cup. Then she walked to Rodrigo with direct, unhesitating steps, and extended the cup and tamales toward him. "Here," she said simply. "With this cold, you need something warm." Rodrigo looked at her. He wanted to say he didn't need charity. He wanted to say he was Rodrigo Castellanos, that he had had more money than that cart would ever see in 100 years. He wanted to say many things that his pride still tried to dictate, though he no longer had the strength to obey it. But what he said was, "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," she replied. "Tonight, nothing." And Rodrigo Castellanos, businessman, ex-magnate, a man who had learned since childhood that nothing in life was free, and that gratitude was a disguised form of debt, took the cup with both hands, felt the warmth of the atole seep through his numb fingers, and said nothing more. The rain kept falling, the cart's little lights flickered softly, and the woman stood at a prudent distance, looking at the night with an expression that Rodrigo, had he been in a condition to read expressions that night, would have recognized as something between relief and compassion, and a very ancient sadness. She knew who he was. He didn't know who she was. And neither of them imagined at that moment how that difference would change their lives. Her memory. The atole was made with cinnamon bark and piloncillo, thick like only hands that learned the recipe from someone who learned it from someone else can make it. A chain of women and hearths lost in time. Rodrigo drank it slowly, without a word. his hands wrapped around the styrofoam cup, as if it were the only warm thing left in the world. And that night, quite literally, it was. The woman with the cart didn't rush him, didn't try to make conversation, didn't look at him with pity, which would have been the worst thing anyone could do to a man in his state. Pity would have shattered him. She simply went about her business, arranging the tamales, checking the burner flame, wiping the tray's edge with a rag. With that capacity, certain people have to be present without being a burden. Rodrigo finished the atole. He placed the cup on the bench beside him, with the almost involuntary care of someone who had been raised with certain manners and retained them even when everything else had fallen apart. He ate one tamale in silence. He held the other in his hand, uneaten, watching the steam rise from the open masa. "Do you go out with this every day?" he finally asked. It wasn't a polite question. It was simply the first thing his brain managed to formulate in human communication mode after hours of internal collapse. "Monday to Saturday," she replied, still arranging things. "I go out at 10 p.m., cover 4 neighborhoods, and get back around 1 or 1:30. In the rain, too." "People who work at night get hungry when it rains, too." Rodrigo nodded slightly. He looked at the cart with more attention than he had initially given it. It was old but well-maintained. The welds on the edges were sanded down, without sharp points. The tray gleamed with the patience of someone who cleaned it every night. The little yellow lights were secured with small wooden clothespins, like the ones grandmothers used to hang laundry. Everything about that cart spoke of scarcity, managed with dignity. "Is the cart yours?" he asked. "Mine and the bank's," she replied, a small smile flashing and vanishing in an instant. "But in that we're like half the country." Rodrigo didn't smile. He couldn't yet. But something in her answer, the honesty without self-pity, the dry humor, the absence of complaint, made him look at her for the first time since she'd appeared. Truly look as one looks at a person, not a landscape. And that's when she spoke. "I know you," she said softly, her gaze still on the tray. "Or I knew you a long time ago." Rodrigo frowned, studying her. The dark hair, the large eyes, the firm jaw, the hands that never stopped moving with a quiet efficiency. Nothing. There was no trace of recognition on her face. "Do we know each other?" he asked. Yes. She looked at him then, and in her eyes there was something that wasn't accusation, nor resentment, nor sentimental nostalgia. It was something more complex, harder to name, the serene recognition of someone who has carried a debt in her chest for 10 years, and who, suddenly, without planning it, finds herself facing the one who created it. "You won't remember me," she said. "And that's fine. I remember you." Her name was Marisol Fuentes, 37 years old, from Tlalpan, daughter of a seamstress and an electrician who died young of a heart attack on the construction site where he worked. It was the first lesson life taught her about what happens to bodies that work tirelessly, without a safety net. She studied accounting for 3 semesters at a public university before the family economy collapsed, and a choice had to be made between her studies and rent. She chose rent, because there was no other option. At 27, she started as a cleaning employee at the Castellanos Group's corporate offices. It was one of those glass buildings on Paseo de la Reforma that seemed designed to remind outsiders how much money they don't have. Marisol cleaned the offices from the 5th to the 10th floors on the 6 a.m. shift. She arrived before almost everyone else. She left when the day was already bustling with people, and she had the characteristic invisibility of those who make others' spaces shine without anyone noticing. She was good at her job. She was punctual, meticulous, quiet in the way people who clean marble floors in corporate buildings are expected to be. But Marisol Fuentes had a peculiarity that no one at that company would have imagined, if anyone had bothered to ask her anything beyond, "Have you finished the executive bathroom yet?" She had an almost photographic accounting memory. 3 semesters of accounting, plus years of watching the family's numbers stretch as far as they could, had developed in her an instinct for numerical patterns that some full-time accountants lack. And Marisol, while cleaning the Castellanos Group's floors, saw things. Not because she spied, not because she looked for them, but simply because documents were left on desks. And people who clean around desks exist in a state of invisibility that makes no one worry about turning a page. Marisol saw invoices, she saw reports, she saw printed transfers that someone had forgotten or discarded. And what she saw didn't add up. Numbers going to accounts that didn't correspond to any supplier she had seen invoiced. Amounts that repeated in patterns too regular to be coincidences. documents with signatures that were not the same as those on authorized documents displayed on the boardroom walls. Marisol was not a certified accountant. She had no rank, no voice, no credentials that would make someone believe her if she said, "Something is wrong here." But she kept everything she saw. She wrote it down in a notebook, with the date and details. For 3 months, from her cleaning post, she reconstructed a partial but coherent picture of something that smelled very foul. And one day, without knowing quite how to channel what she had, she went directly to the Director of Administration's office and asked to speak with him. What happened next was swift and brutal. The Director of Administration listened to her with that cold courtesy executives have when someone without power tells them something they don't want to hear. He told her he appreciated her concern, but these were complex accounting matters beyond the reach of someone in her position. The next day, Marisol was called by the cleaning coordinator and informed that her contract would not be renewed due to a restructuring of the department. There was no severance pay, no letter of recommendation, nothing. Just the end. But what happened 3 weeks after she was fired was what changed everything. Marisol was carrying 2 buckets of water in the hallway on the 4th floor. She had returned that day to pick up some personal belongings she had forgotten. Then, the wet floor betrayed her right foot in a fraction of a second. She fell backward. The fall was bad. Her head hit the edge of the cleaning cart, her hip against the marble. She lay on the floor, unable to get up, the world spinning, and a pain in her hip that stole her breath. Her colleagues on the floor called the security guard. The guard called the coordinator, and the coordinator, efficient and pragmatic, well aware that Marisol was no longer an active employee and that an accident on company premises involving someone no longer active was a legal problem of considerable dimensions, began to do what systems do when someone without power becomes a problem. She started to dilute, to distance, to talk about protocols and verification of contractual status. Marisol was on the 4th floor tile, her hip broken, a fracture the doctor would confirm hours later. When the elevator door opened, Rodrigo Castellanos emerged. It was 7:15 in the morning. Rodrigo always arrived early. He saw everything in a second. The woman on the floor, the puddle of water, the overturned cart, the group of people standing around, making the passive gesture of those waiting for someone else to decide what to do. "What happened?" he asked, his voice direct, the kind that doesn't ask rhetorical questions. Everyone spoke at once. Rodrigo raised a hand to silence them all and knelt beside Marisol. He asked her name, where she hurt, if she could move her foot. He had eyes the color of dark coffee and an expression that was neither condescending nor performatively compassionate. It was simply that of someone assessing a situation with the intention of resolving it. "We're going to call an ambulance," he said, standing up. "And someone is going to explain to me why this lady was carrying those buckets alone." The coordinator tried to say something about her contractual status. Rodrigo looked at her in a way that made the sentence die in her throat. "Contractual status will be resolved later. Right now, what matters is that this person is injured on our premises. Call an ambulance. I'll cover the medical expenses." And so it was. Rodrigo Castellanos paid for Marisol Fuentes' hip surgery, the hospital stay, the rehabilitation, the 3 months of medication. He did it out of his personal funds, not the company's, to avoid entangling the legal process. He did it without fanfare, without asking for photos, without talking to the media. He did it because he thought it was the right thing to do, and because deep down, very deep down, behind the Italian suits and the meetings in Los Pinos, Rodrigo Castellanos was still the son of a bricklayer from Ecatepec, who knew perfectly well what it was like to fall on someone else's floor without anyone taking responsibility. Marisol could never thank him directly. When she tried to contact him weeks later, after she had recovered, she was told the director was on a business trip, then that he was in meetings, then that the corporate office didn't handle personal communications of that nature. Life went on. Years passed. Marisol got by, as she always did, working, saving, enduring, but she never forgot. And now she stood before him in a park, in the rain, with the tamale and atole cart that was the result of 10 years of starting from scratch, whenever necessary, looking at the man who had once saved her, unknowingly, at the worst moment of her life. "You paid for my hip surgery," Marisol had said softly, 10 years ago in the Castellanos Group building. "I fell on the 4th floor, and you called the ambulance and covered all the expenses. I was the cleaning lady on the morning shift." Rodrigo looked at her. Something stirred in his memory. A flash, a blurry image of a morning long ago, a woman on the floor, the pine scent of an overturned cleaning cart, but the image was imprecise, without a defined face, like all the things one does, without giving them importance at the time. He began. You don't have to remember me, she said without bitterness. What you didn't do for me to remember. I realized that later when I noticed there was no note, no card, nothing with your name, just the hospital bill with the legend, paid in full. Rodrigo fell silent. I've spent 10 years thinking about how to thank you, Marisol continued. What you did was no small thing. That surgery gave me back the ability to walk properly, and walking properly is what allows me to push this cart, what allows me to support my daughter, what allows me to keep going. She turned off the burner flame with a flick of her wrist and looked directly at Rodrigo. So tonight, Mr. Castellanos, she said, even if you don't know what happened to you, or why you're sitting here on this bench in the rain, with that ruined suit and that look like the world has ended, tonight, I'm the one paying the debt, even if it's with atole and tamales. Rodrigo Castellanos, who hadn't cried in 48 hours of absolute collapse, who hadn't cried when the auditors called him, nor when the banks started talking about foreclosures, nor when Valentina closed the door with that dry, final slam, felt something hot and inconvenient pressing behind his eyes. He cleared his throat. He looked away, toward the wet darkness of the park, toward nowhere. What's your name? He asked, his voice barely steady. Marisol? She said. Marisol Fuentes. Marisol? He repeated, as if storing it somewhere inside. Thank you for the atole. She nodded, and without making a fuss, with that naturalness she had for turning big moments into manageable things, she unhooked one of the little yellow lights that had fallen off its clip and carefully reattached it. It's going to keep raining, she said. Do you have somewhere to go tonight? And Rodrigo Castellanos, former magnate, ex-owner of a white marble penthouse with a panoramic view of the city that was no longer his, looked at the rain and didn't answer, because the truth was, he didn't. The longest night. Marisol Fuentes was not a woman who made decisions lightly. 10 years of raising a daughter alone, of managing every peso with the precision of someone who knows the next one isn't guaranteed, of learning to distinguish between people who deserve trust and people who only seem to, had honed her instincts to the point of near infallibility. And her instinct that night told her two simultaneous and seemingly contradictory things. That the man sitting on that bench was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with violence, and that she couldn't leave him there. The danger wasn't him. It was what a man with that weight on him could do to himself, alone in a park at midnight in the rain, with nowhere to go. Marisol knew that kind of loneliness. She had seen it in her father in the months before his heart attack, when the construction site where he worked started to go badly, and he would come home with slumped shoulders and empty eyes, and a smile that was no longer a smile, but the muscular memory of having once smiled. He had learned to recognize that expression for what it was. The moment a person stopped seeing themselves as something worth holding on to. Rodrigo Castellanos wore that expression. Come, she said, without alarm, without drama, in the same voice she might have used to say, the atole is ready. My apartment is 4 blocks away. There's a sofa. It's small, but it's dry. Rodrigo looked at her. I can't accept that. You already accepted the atole and the tamales, Marisol replied, starting to push the cart. The sofa is more of the same. Come. There was no further argument. Rodrigo rose from the wet bench with the weight of someone whose muscles had forgotten their purpose. He picked up his soaked jacket and followed Marisol and her cart through the rain-slicked streets, with the docility of one who no longer had the energy to resist reasonable things. The 4 blocks were silent. Marisol pushed the cart with its squeaking wheels, and Rodrigo walked beside her, hands in his wet trouser pockets, looking at the ground. They passed a convenience store with its sign lit up, a closed taqueria with chairs stacked on tables, a dog that watched them from a doorway without barking. The city at night has a particular intimacy that the city by day never does. It reveals its true structure without the veneer of movement and noise. Marisol's building was 4 stories high, a peeling salmon-colored stucco facade, stairs without an elevator, black metal handrails. 3rd floor, apartment 3B. Marisol left the cart chained downstairs, a combination lock, the chain wrapped twice around the nearest post, and went up ahead of Rodrigo with silent steps, careful not to make noise on the creaking wooden stairs if one didn't know where to step. My daughter is sleeping, she said softly, without turning. I don't want to wake her. Rodrigo nodded in the darkness. Apartment 3B, had a living room, an integrated kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom. It was small, with an unapologetic honesty. The walls were painted white with damp spots in a corner. The floor was Talavera mosaic in green and yellow, a window with blue checkered curtains that didn't entirely block the streetlight. There was a dining table with 2.5 chairs, a makeshift bookshelf made of planks and bricks, where secondhand novels mingled with school notebooks, and a clay figure of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and a 3-seater burgundy sofa that had seen better days but held itself with dignity. On the walls were drawings, many, taped with clear tape, some framed with colored paper, arranged without apparent order but with evident affection. Drawings of houses with chimneys puffing out clouds of hearts, of families beneath the sun, of animals with names written below in a child's handwriting, of a woman with an apron and a food cart that Rodrigo immediately recognized as Marisol, seen through her daughter's eyes. "Sit down," Marisol said, gesturing to the sofa. "I'm going to get you a blanket and some dry clothes. I have some from my cousin who stayed here last month. They'll fit you more or less. You don't have to," Rodrigo began. "I know I don't have to," she interrupted him, not brusquely. "I'm doing it because I want to. There's a difference." Rodrigo sat on the burgundy sofa. He heard Marisol moving in the bedroom, drawers opening carefully, the soft creak of the floor under her precise steps. He looked at the drawings on the walls and felt something he couldn't quite name. A kind of inverted shame. The discomfort of finding himself in a space completely alien to everything his life had been, and realizing that this space, despite everything, or perhaps precisely because of everything, felt more alive than the white marble penthouse he had abandoned hours earlier. Marisol returned with a plaid wool blanket and a set of gray sweatpants and a blue t-shirt, neatly folded. "The bathroom is at the end. There are clean towels on the shelf above." Then, as if thinking for a second, she added, "The heater takes 3 minutes to heat up, no more, if you don't use too much gas." Rodrigo took the clothes without a word. He went to the bathroom, which was small and impeccably clean, the kind of cleanliness that has nothing to do with money, but with habit and self-respect. And he stood in front of the mirror for the first time in hours. What he saw stopped him. He didn't recognize himself immediately. The man in the mirror had hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, a 2-day-old beard that was already crossing the line of neglect, deep circles under his eyes, his tie undone around the collar of his white shirt, which was no longer white but gray with dampness. He had the face of someone who had aged several years in 48 hours, which was exactly what had happened to him. He showered with the hottest water the heater could provide in 3 minutes. He changed into his cousin's clothes, which were short in the legs and wide in the shoulders, but were dry and smelled of fabric softener. That smell of synthetic flowers that Rodrigo vaguely associated with neighborhood laundromats, and which that night seemed the most comforting smell he had known in a long time. He came out of the bathroom and found Marisol in the kitchen, her back to him, preparing something in silence. On the table there was a glass of water and 2 aspirins. "For when you wake up," she said without turning. "With everything you carried today, you're going to wake up with a headache." Rodrigo sat on the sofa and wrapped himself in the plaid blanket. Marisol turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the street light, which entered through the blue checkered window, and sat in the chair opposite the sofa with a cup of tea in her hands. "You don't have to stay awake for me," he said. "I'm not staying up for you," Marisol replied. "It's my tea time. I do it every night before bed since Camila was a baby. It's the only thing that belongs only to me in the day." Rodrigo nodded. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the silence of 2 people who had been through difficult things, and who knew, without saying it, that some things don't need words to be understood. "How old is your daughter?" he asked. 8. Her name is Camila." A brief pause, laden with that quiet pride that mothers who have raised children alone possess and wouldn't trade, even if they could. "She's the smartest person I know. Her father isn't around. No drama, no visible resentment. He never really was. Sometimes it's easier that way." He cleared his throat. Rodrigo asked no more questions. Marisol finished her tea, and at some point, without Rodrigo consciously deciding to close his eyes, the exhaustion of 48 hours without sleep overcame him with the efficiency of anesthesia, and he fell asleep on the burgundy sofa, the plaid blanket pulled up to his chin, with the face of a man who, for the first time in 2 days, was thinking of nothing. Marisol watched him fall asleep and waited a few minutes before getting up. She adjusted the blanket where it had slipped. She turned off the small lamp on the bookshelf, which she had left on so as not to leave him in complete darkness, and went to the bedroom where Camila slept curled up in the center of the bed, as always, taking up 3 times more space than her size warranted. She lay down beside her on the edge, careful not to wake her. It took her a while to fall asleep. She lay there for a while, looking at the dark ceiling, listening to the rain outside, and beneath the rain, Camila's quiet breathing, and the silence of the man sleeping on her sofa. 10 years. She had waited 10 years to be able to say thank you to someone who probably didn't even remember her. And when it had finally happened, that someone's world was in pieces. Life had a very particular irony for those who observed it closely. Marisol closed her eyes at 6:15 in the morning, when the sky still hesitated between night and day, and the rain had dwindled to a lazy trickle. Marisol was already dressed, apron on, hair tied back, preparing breakfast in silence. She left at 6:30 without waking Rodrigo, without waking Camila. She had a cleaning shift at a doctor's office in Coyoacán at 7, then 2 hours at an accounting office in Insurgentes, then preparing the cart for the evening. The day didn't wait. She left a plate with 2 toast with beans and fresh cheese on the dining table, covered with a kitchen towel to keep it warm, and next to the plate, she left a folded piece of paper. When Rodrigo woke up at 8:15, later than he had slept in years, his body suddenly demanding what it was owed. The first thing he saw was the white ceiling, with the damp spot in the corner. The second was the drawings on the walls. The third was that he was alone. He sat up slowly, with the backache that an overnight stay on a small sofa inevitably leaves for a man his size, and found the plate of toast and the folded paper. He opened it. The toast is for reheating, 2 minutes on the griddle over low heat. The bathroom is free until 9. My daughter has breakfast at 8:30 before school. Don't tell her who you are, please. Just that you're an acquaintance. Rodrigo was rereading the note when he heard small, determined footsteps coming from the bedroom. He quickly folded the paper and put it in the pocket of the gray sweatpants. Camila Fuentes was 8 years old, her mother's black hair in 2 braids that weren't exactly symmetrical, because she had evidently done them herself, and the most direct eyes Rodrigo had seen in a long time in any person of any age. She entered the living room, saw him on the sofa with the blanket still on, and wasn't scared or made a fuss. She just tilted her head slightly, as if assessing, and said, "Good morning. Are you my mom's acquaintance?" "Yes," Rodrigo replied. "Are you hungry? A little?" "The toast is for reheating," Camila said in exactly the same practical tone as her mother, and went to the kitchen. Rodrigo watched her from the sofa. The girl took out the griddle, put it on the burner, adjusted the flame with a naturalness that spoke of years of having seen the same thing done. She put the toast to warm, and while she waited, she took a math notebook out of her backpack and started doing homework at the dining table, as if having a stranger on her sofa was the most normal thing in the world. They ate breakfast together in relative silence. Camila ate and did multiplications, without taking her eyes off the notebook. Rodrigo ate and looked at the drawings on the walls. "Did you do those drawings?" he asked. "Most of them," Camila replied without looking up. "The ones at the bottom are from when I was 5. I wouldn't draw them the same now. They're good." "Thank you." A pause. "The one of the lady with the card is my mom, in case you didn't recognize her." I recognized her. Camila looked up for the first time. She looked at him with that unfiltered directness of children who haven't yet learned that looking directly is considered rude in the adult world. "Why do you have a face like something very bad happened?" Rodrigo asked. He didn't know what to answer. "Why did it happen?" he said finally. Camila considered him seriously. Then she returned to her notebook. "My mom says that bad things happen, so you learn what you didn't learn any other way." She erased something with the eraser end of the pencil. I don't know if that's true, but she's almost always right. At 8:50, Camila gathered her notebook, put everything in her green dinosaur backpack, brushed her teeth, put on her shoes, and left for school, with a "see you later," said to the air, with no specific direction. Rodrigo was left alone in apartment 3B. On the back of the sofa where he had slept, he found something he hadn't seen the night before. A new drawing made with colored pencils, of a man sitting on a bench in the rain to whom a woman was giving a steaming cup. In the bottom right corner, in the large, round handwriting of an 8-year-old girl, it read, "The Sad Man in the Park." Rodrigo held it for a long moment with both hands, then carefully folded it and tucked it into the breast pocket of the soaked jacket hanging on the chair. Outside, the city had dawned without rain for the first time in 2 days. Complete betrayal. Rodrigo had no laptop, No corporate phone that he'd left on his desk at Penuz when he'd walked out the night before, aimless and without a plan. All he had was his personal cell phone, a mid-range model he used exclusively for private matters, which, fortunately, he'd kept in his jacket pocket instead of his briefcase. The battery read 16% when he took it out that morning in Marisol's apartment, sitting at the dining room table, facing an empty plate of toast. He searched all his pockets for the charger, knowing he didn't have it. He didn't have it. Marisol had told him in her note that the bathroom would be free until 9. It was 9:08. He checked the wall charger by the bed that he could see through the ajar bedroom door, a phone charger, USB-C connector. His was lightning, incompatible, 16%. Rodrigo calculated he had to use it wisely. He called Carlos Mendeville first, his trusted external lawyer. Not the corporate one who had sent the cold email, but a man he'd known since high school, one he'd helped pay through college when they were both young and broke. Carlos answered on the second ring with a voice that wasn't the voice of someone who sees Rodrigo's name on the screen and is happy. It was the voice of someone who had been expecting this call with a mix of relief and horror. "Rodrigo, thank God. Where are you?" "At an acquaintance place." "I'm fine. What do you know?" Carlos's pause lasted just long enough to indicate that what he knew was worse than Rodrigo imagined. "A lot, and almost none of what you'll want to hear. You have time, 16% battery, and no charger. Summarize." Carlos Mendeville took a deep breath. Esteban Fuerte left the country the night before last. Flight to Miami, connecting to the Cayman Islands. He traveled with documentation under the name Eduardo Fuerte Blanco, his middle name, which has a valid passport. I know that because a friend in immigration did me a favor. A pause. The account issue is systematic, Rodrigo. It's not a crime of opportunity. It's a planned extraction over at least 3 years. There are invoices from ghost suppliers, transfers to shell companies in Panama and Delaware, and a scheme of over-invoicing on 6 government contracts that someone put together with a deep understanding of your internal structure. Esteban had been with the company for 12 years, Rodrigo said, his voice flat with someone processing something that wasn't quite sinking in. "I know, and I'm sorry, but there's more." The 16% was still there, but Rodrigo felt his own body's battery draining in real time. "Tell me, the access to the security accounts, the authorization level to move those amounts without triggering internal alerts. Esteban didn't have that alone. There was a second signature enabled in the system 2 years ago." Carlos took another, longer pause. The signature was Valentina's. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Rodrigo heard his own breathing. "Repeat that," he said, though he'd understood perfectly the first time. The executive-level digital access signature to the group's accounts was registered under the name Valentina Iturriaga de Castellanos. It was enabled 26 months ago. Rodrigo, she didn't just know what was happening. She was part of the mechanism. The phone was at 12%. Rodrigo didn't notice. Valentina, 14 years of marriage. The woman who had chosen every painting on the walls of Penuz, who knew the combination to his personal safe, who had attended Christmas dinners with his partners for over a decade, with that perfect smile and that ability to say the right things at the right time. The woman who, 2 nights ago, had slammed the door shut and told him he was always a failure. She'd said it without a tremor in her voice, without a flicker of guilt, because she knew exactly what she had done and had rehearsed that exit for months. "How long have they been together?" Rodrigo asked. It wasn't a question he needed to ask. He knew it the moment he formulated it, but he needed to hear it. "According to what I found," Carlos chose his words with the care of a surgeon, "at least 4 years. There are hotel records, trips that coincide with your business trips, and a property in your name, bought through a company that has Valentina as the final beneficiary. The company was incorporated 3 years and 2 months ago." Rodrigo closed his eyes. 4 years. While he was building contracts, negotiating with the federal government, flying to meetings in Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Ciudad Juarez, convinced he was building something worthwhile, something that would last, something that made sense. Valentina and Esteban had been dismantling it brick by brick from the inside for 4 years, with her signature, with her passwords, with the access he had given them freely, because that's how trust works. You grant it without inventory, without audit, because if you audit the people you say you love, then it's no longer love, but accounting. "Is there any way to recover anything?" he asked. "Yes," Carlos said, and in that monosyllable there was enough determination for Rodrigo to know his friend had already been thinking about this. "Not all is lost. The shell companies have records, the transfers leave a trail. The problem is time and money for the legal process." And right now, both are scarce. I need you physically here as soon as possible, and I need you to contact certain people who can still help you before this goes cold. Give me 24 hours, Rodrigo. 24 hours, Carlos. Give me that. A pause. Okay, but charge your phone. The call ended. The battery read 9%. Rodrigo sat in the kitchen chair with the dead phone in his hands. He had turned it off himself to conserve what was left, and he looked at the oilcloth tablecloth with its pattern of yellow sunflowers on a navy blue background, and thought of Valentina, with a coldness that felt strange even to him. It wasn't rage yet. The rage would come later. He knew that with the ferocity of things that accumulate in silence. Now it was just a dry, almost clinical understanding. He had been the instrument of his own destruction because he had trusted the wrong people with the right intensity. What hurt wasn't the money. The money was recoverable to some extent, with time and work. What hurt was the architecture of the betrayal. How meticulous, how patient, how sustained it had been. 4 years of perfect lies required a kind of determination that Rodrigo, in his entire life as a businessman, had never had to apply to anything other than building. They had used the same energy he put into building, but to destroy. And they had done it from the inside with his own keys. He was still in that state, his mind spinning in ever-tightening circles around the same center, when he heard the key in the lock and the apartment door opened. Marisol entered with 2 grocery bags in her arms, her apron still on, though it was already midday. The Coyoacan clinic finished at 11. The accounting office lasted until 1, but she'd left early today because the accountant had canceled, and her hair was slightly loose from its morning bun. She saw Rodrigo sitting at the table with the dead phone in his hands, and looked at him the way Marisol looked at almost everything, directly, without preamble, evaluating without judging. "Did you eat anything else besides the toast?" she asked, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. "No. How long have you been sitting there?" "I don't know." Marisol washed her hands, took out a pot, and began to put water on to boil with the mechanical efficiency of someone who cooks without thinking, because cooking is part of the muscular system of her life. "Do you want to tell me about it?" She set her back to him. Rodrigo looked at her. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. And it wasn't ingratitude. It was genuine incomprehension. He was a man she had met less than 12 hours ago, sitting on a park bench in the rain, and she had brought him to her home. She had given him her sofa, let him have breakfast with her daughter, and now she was putting water on to boil, as if it were part of the natural order of things. Marisol took a moment to answer. She arranged vegetables on the cutting board, picked up the knife with a hand that knew exactly where it was, because it was always in the same place. "Because you helped me when I had no reason to," she said. "And because my mother taught me that good debts aren't paid with money, they're paid with the same thing you were given. Your mother taught you well. My mother was a seamstress. She sewed 12 hours a day and still had time to teach me what matters." A pause. "What did you discover on the phone?" Rodrigo exhaled slowly. "That my partner fled the country with my money." Pause. "And that my wife helped him." Marisol's knife stopped over the carrot for half a second. Only half a second. His wife was in on this for over 2 years, according to my lawyer. Probably longer. "They've been together for 4 years. Marisol said nothing for a moment. She continued cutting vegetables, but Rodrigo could see in the tension of her shoulders that she was processing. "Did you know?" she asked. It wasn't an accusatory question, but the question of someone who needs to pinpoint the map of another's pain to know how to move near it. "No," Rodrigo said. "I didn't know. And that's the hardest thing to accept, that I didn't see anything." "Sometimes you don't see because you don't want to see," Marisol said with a gentle honesty. "It's not blindness. It's that you decide to believe that reality is what you want it to be." She tossed the vegetables into the pot. "I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because the other thing, the version where you're stupid or naive or responsible, is worse, and it's a lie." Rodrigo looked at her for a long moment. 10 years ago," he said, "when you were fired from the company after your fall. Yes. Why didn't you sue, given what happened? You had sufficient grounds." Marisol stirred the pot with the wooden spoon. "Because back then I was 26, I had no money for a lawyer, I had just had hip surgery and 3 months of recovery ahead of me, and the company quietly offered me a smaller severance in exchange for not making a fuss." A brief pause. "I accepted because I needed to eat and pay rent. That's how the world works when you have no safety net, Mr. Castellanos." Rodrigo nodded slowly. "But before they fired me," Marisol continued without drama, in the same voice she would have used to say anything mundane, I saw things at that company that didn't add up. I noted them down, I kept them. Rodrigo tensed. What kind of things? Transfers that didn't correspond, invoices from suppliers who didn't exist, records that repeated in patterns that weren't normal. I studied accounting for 3 semesters. I didn't become an accountant, but I understand numbers, and those numbers weren't right. She turned to look at him. What did you do with what you saw? Rodrigo asked carefully. I went to report it to the director of administration. The next day, they told me my contract wouldn't be renewed. Marisol looked at him intently. Do you know who the director of administration was back then? Rodrigo already knew before she said it, but he listened anyway, because he needed to hear it out loud for it to be completely real. Esteban Fuerte, Marisol said, and the world of Rodrigo Castellanos, which he thought had finished collapsing the night before, found a new bottom. If Esteban had been orchestrating this scheme long before Marisol discovered it and fired her to silence her, then this hadn't started 3 years ago. It had begun over 10. And somewhere in that history, someone had kept the proof. Marisol, Rodrigo said, his voice unlike any he'd used in the past 48 hours. It wasn't the voice of a defeated man, nor that of an executive in crisis. It was the voice of a man who had just spotted an exit in a room he believed was completely sealed. What happened to those notes Marisol made? She turned off the burner, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at him with an expression that was both that of someone who had waited 10 years for someone to ask that exact question, and that of someone who still wasn't entirely sure if answering it was a good idea. I kept them, she said. He still has them. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it takes to make a decision you know will change everything. Yes, Marisol said. I have them. And in that moment, in a small kitchen with a pot of steaming vegetables and a sunflower-patterned tablecloth of yellow on navy blue, something began that neither of them had planned, but which fate, or justice, or life, which are sometimes the same thing, had spent 10 years preparing the first step for. Rodrigo Castellanos had built his first contract at 23 with 400 borrowed from his uncle, a pickup truck with a cracked windshield, and absolute conviction. The only kind of conviction that works when you have nothing else to offer but the belief that work done with rigor will eventually speak for itself. 22 years later, that conviction was the only thing Esteban Fuerte and Valentina hadn't been able to steal from him, because it was the only thing they had never understood existed. That was what he thought that morning, standing in front of the bathroom mirror in apartment 3B, shaving with the disposable razor Marisol had placed, without comment, on the sink next to a folded towel. He thought it with the cold clarity that sometimes arrives after a collapse, when the brain finishes processing the blow and begins, almost against its will, to search for the angle from which one can still stand. He had debts. He had a long and expensive legal process ahead of him. His name was tarnished in the corporate circles where he had operated for 2 decades. Because the news of the Castellanos Group's collapse was already on the business portals. Carlos had sent him the links by message before the battery died completely. And in that kind of news, there's always a mixture of fact and rumor that does damage before anyone has the chance to deny anything. But he also had something he hadn't had 48 hours ago, a loose thread. And if there was one thing Rodrigo Castellanos knew how to do, it was to pull a thread until the whole thing unraveled or was rebuilt, depending on where he pulled. He left the bathroom with his black suit jacket folded over his arm, already dry, though irrevocably wrinkled, and found Marisol in the kitchen, finishing preparing something wrapped in wax paper. They're for the cart tonight, she explained without him asking. I make the tamales early so they rest well. She glanced at him. Did you eat? Yes, thank you. Do you have a plan? The beginning of one. Marisol nodded and continued working. I need to charge my phone, Rodrigo said. Is there a store nearby where I can buy a charger? On the corner, there's a stationery shop that sells everything. She paused. You'll also need money for that. Rodrigo opened his mouth to say he had it and stopped himself in time, because the reality was, he had 320 pesos in cash left in his wallet from the last time he'd paid for a coffee with cash, and a personal credit card whose available limit was uncertain, given the state of the linked accounts. I have some, he said. All right. Marisol wiped her hands and went to the shelf where she kept her purse. She took out a 200 peso bill and placed it on the counter without meeting his eyes, with the naturalness of someone doing a practical thing and not wanting to turn it into a moment. In case it's not enough, Marisol, you'll pay me back when you can. She rolled another tamale. Oh no, it's not the end of the world. Rodrigo took the bill. He didn't say thank you again, because he had already said it too many times in 12 hours. and the word was starting to feel insufficient for what he was receiving. "I'm going to need to ask you for another favor," he said. "Tell me, the notes you saved from when you worked at the company, I need to see them. Not now, not if you're not ready, but soon." Marisol didn't answer immediately. She continued working with her hands on the dough with that concentration she applied to physical things as if they were meditation. "Tonight," she finally said, "when I get back from the cart, if you still want to, I'll be here." She looked at him then directly, with those large eyes that had no filter of social courtesy. "Are you going out today to do what?" Rodrigo thought for a second. "To start," he said. What Rodrigo didn't tell Marisol that midday was that starting had a very concrete and unglamorous form that he couldn't have explained without sounding like what it was. The decision of a man who has lost everything to do the only thing he knows how to do, which is to work with whatever he has available at the moment, in the place where he is. And what he had available was Marisol's cart. The idea didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments, as he walked to the corner stationery store with his own 320 pesos and Marisol's 200 in his pocket, looking at the neighborhood with the new attention of someone who had always flown over it in his Suburban and was now treading it for the first time. There was life here he had never seen up close. The lady selling juices on the sidewalk with her industrial blender, the man at the newspaper stand who knew every customer's name, the laundry with sheets hanging on the rooftop clothesline, waving like flags of something everyday and true. He bought the charger, charged his phone, sitting on a bench in front of the stationery store for 40 minutes, making 3 key calls as the battery climbed from 0, to Carlos Mendeville, to coordinate the next legal steps, to a trusted former associate, to ask for an information favor, and to his personal bank to understand exactly what he had and what he didn't. What he had was little, what he didn't have was almost everything. But little and nothing are different categories, and Rodrigo Castellanos knew that better than anyone. He returned to the apartment at 4 p.m. Marisol was preparing the cart for the evening run. She checked the burner's flame, counted the wrapped tamales, filled the atole container, adjusted the little yellow lights that always detached from her tongs. Rodrigo watched her work for a moment. "Can I help?" he asked. Marisol looked up. "With what?" "Whatever. With the cart." She studied him with her direct gaze. "Have you ever sold food on the street?" "No." "Have you pushed one of those carts through 4 neighborhoods at midnight? Do you know how much a tamale costs and how much a tole costs? And how to make change for someone with a 500 peso bill at 1 a.m.? "No, but I can learn, Mar." Sol considered it. Something flickered across her expression. Not exactly a smile, but close. "All right," she said. "But obey what I say on the cart. I'm the boss. Understood? And if someone recognizes you and makes a scene, you stay quiet and I'll talk. Understood? And don't complain about the ramps. There are 3 on the route that are very bad, and the cart is heavy. Understood." Marisol handed him a navy blue apron, the spare she kept folded in the cart's bag for when hers got too wet. "Put it on," she said. "You look like what you are in that suit." They went out at 10 p.m. Rodrigo pushed the cart, which indeed was heavy, and the bad ramps were exactly as bad as Marisol had warned. And Marisol walked beside him, setting the pace and the route with the calm authority of someone who knows her territory. The first 2 hours were relatively anonymous. Marisol's cart's nocturnal customers were night shift workers, security guards, taxi drivers on break, young couples returning late from somewhere. No one looked at Rodrigo with particular attention. No one recognized him. He was just the man in the blue apron serving a toll, while the lady collected money. It was in the 3rd hour that it happened. A man with a phone in his hand waiting for his tamale looked at him twice, then a 3rd time. Then he took out his phone, looked for something on the screen, looked back at him, and took a photo. The next day, that photo was on 3 business gossip portals and in several WhatsApp groups with the same caption, varying in wording but identical in intent. Rodrigo Castellanos, former director of Castellanos Group, selling tacos on the street after the collapse of his company. The comments were exactly what one imagines comments on those kinds of posts to be. A mix of schadenfreude, cheap moralism, and people who had never heard of Rodrigo Castellanos until that moment, but had a very formed opinion about his character and his desserts. Rodrigo knew at 7 a.m. the next morning, when Carlos Mendeville sent him the links with a message saying, "Do you want me to come out and deny something?" Rodrigo replied, "No, let them say what they want. because something had happened that night on the cart's route that no WhatsApp photo could capture. Sometime between the second and third neighborhood, pushing that cart through streets he had never walked, serving atole to people he had never seen, listening to Marisol exchange names and short jokes with her regular customers. Mrs. Consuelo from the Pink Building, who always ordered Rajas tamales. The gas station boy who drank atole to endure his shift. The elderly couple who went out for a walk every night and always ended up at the cart. Rodrigo had felt something he hadn't expected to feel, that the ground was beneath his feet. Not the metaphorical ground of success or financial security, but literal, real ground, the damp pavement of the streets of a middle-class neighborhood in Mexico City, beneath his shoes, which were already beginning to show the wear of difficult days. Concrete, real ground, without intermediaries. And on that ground he could stand. The rest he would build. The videos arrived on the third day, not the videos from the gossip portals, those he had already seen. Other videos, recordings that some people from the night route had made, with the opposite intention, not to ridicule, but to show something that, for some reason, they felt was worthy of being seen, even if none of them could articulate exactly why. In one of them, recorded by Mrs. Consuelo from her apartment window, Rodrigo was seen pushing the cart uphill on a broken ramp, his teeth clenched and his shoulders tense, while Marisol walked ahead, setting the pace and without looking back, because she knew he would manage on his own, because she had already seen him do it the night before. The video had no text, only the sound of the night street and the squeaking wheels of the cart. And at the end, when they reached the level ground and Rodrigo let out a long exhale of effort, Marisol's soft laughter said, "See? The ramps know you now." That video had 400,000 views in 48 hours. The comments were different from those on the gossip portals. They said things like, "This is dignity, and more respect than half of those who have never fallen. And who is the lady with the cart? She's the story." Marisol saw the comments about her on Rodrigo's phone. She didn't have social media, never had. It was a practical decision from someone who had no time to waste on screens, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he handed the phone back. "People have too much free time," he said, and went to check the burner. Rodrigo put the phone away. But something about those 400,000 numbers had moved him in a way he hadn't expected. Not ego, not the vanity one might assume in a man accustomed to corporate spotlights. It was something else. It was the confirmation that the ground was still there, solid, and that on top of that ground were real people watching, and that what those people were watching wasn't the fall, but the way of standing up afterwards. That was what needed to be built next. And to build it, he needed Marisol's evidence, what no one knew about Marisol. The folder was navy blue, made of sturdy cardstock with the kind of metal clasp that no one uses anymore because everything is stored in clouds and servers and external drives. But Marisol had chosen it precisely for that reason, because what is on paper exists in a way that digital does not. Digital can be deleted, hacked, lost in an update. Paper, if one keeps it well, simply is. She took it out from under the bed, from the deepest part, behind a shoebox, and Camila's school portfolio from the previous year. It had a thin layer of dust on the top edge that Marisol wiped away with a cloth before placing it on the dining room table, a gesture of cleaning it before handing it over, as if the folder deserved to be presented with care. It said something about her that no word could have said better. It was almost 1 a.m. Camila was asleep. The apartment was silent, except for the distant sound of a truck on the avenue and the occasional drip of the kitchen faucet that Marisol had meant to fix for 2 weeks, because the plumber charged an arm and a leg. Rodrigo sat down in front of the folder. Marisol sat on the other side of the table, her hands clasped on top of the sunflower-patterned oilcloth, like someone about to make a declaration who had waited for the right moment for longer than anyone should have to wait. "Before I open it," Marisol said, "I need to tell you something I didn't tell you before." Rodrigo looked up. "When I went to report the irregularities to the director of administration," she began, her voice calm like someone who has rehearsed a story in their head so many times that it no longer trembles when told. "I didn't go unprepared. I went with copies. I had photocopied the documents I found over 3 weeks. Not all of them, because I didn't always have the opportunity. But the most important ones, the ones with numbers that didn't add up, the ones with signatures that didn't correspond to the authorization system I had learned to read from the notices on the boardroom walls." A pause. "Esteban Fuerte listened to me. He told me he appreciated my initiative, and the next day I received my non-renewal notice. You already know that." "Yes. What I didn't tell you is that same night, before I was notified of anything, I already knew something was going to happen. I saw it in Esteban's face when I left his office. There's a look people have when they decide you are a problem that needs to be solved. His eyes were very direct. My father had that look once when they told him at the construction site that they were going to review his employment situation. 2 days later, he was out of a job. You learn to recognize it. What did you do that night? Before leaving the building, I made more copies of everything in the filing cabinets on the 4th floor, which were unlocked because no one thought the cleaning lady might have any interest in what was inside. A very brief pause. And I took them in my grocery bag, under the oranges. Rodrigo looked at her for a second without saying anything. Under the oranges, he repeated. No one checks the cleaning lady's grocery bag, Marisol said. Not with vanity, but just as a statement of fact. I learned that from my mom too. Invisibility, when you can't change it, becomes a tool. Rodrigo opened the folder. What was inside was more than he had expected. It wasn't just a notebook, though that was there. 80 pages, written in tight, neat handwriting, with the date and description of every anomaly Marisol had observed over 3 months. There were documents, photocopies of invoices, some with the letterheads of suppliers Rodrigo immediately recognized as companies the group had worked with, and which, seen now with the trained eye of someone who knew exactly what to look for, revealed inconsistencies that no one had wanted to see at the time. There were records of transfers with received stamps. There were 2 printed emails, printed on paper dated 10 years and 3 months ago. They were internal communications between Esteban Fuerte and an email address Rodrigo didn't recognize, but which Carlos Mendevil would recognize because it was the type of shell company address that corporate recovery lawyers know by structure. Rodrigo turned the pages slowly. 1 a.m. became 2 a.m. Marisol made him tea without asking, because it was his tea time and because the moment called for it. And she sat there, reading aloud what he pointed out, explaining the context of each document, with the precise memory of someone who not only copied papers, but understood them. This supplier, Marisol said, pointing to an invoice, appears in 4 different contracts in the 5th quarter. Same amount, different services supposedly rendered, but the services are incompatible with each other. You can't do soil consulting and heavy machinery rental and also environmental studies with the same RFC and the same number of employees. It's operationally impossible. How do you know that? Marisol shrugged slightly. Because when you clean the offices of a construction company for 8 months, you learn how a construction company works. The documents people leave on desks and in printers are like a manual that no one gives anyone, but that is there for anyone who reads it. A pause. I read a lot. Rodrigo looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't condescension. It was something closer to genuine recognition from someone who had just realized they had been underestimating the intelligence of the person in front of them, not out of malice, but out of the blind inertia of the prejudices one carries without knowing they carry them. You studied accounting? He said. 3 semesters. Why did you leave? Because my mom got sick and someone had to work. You finished later, didn't you? After that came Camila and the stroller and everything else, she said. Without bitterness, just facts. But I learned those 3 semesters well. Rodrigo closed the folder for a moment and looked at her directly. Marisol, what you have here, he said, gesturing to the folder with an open hand, is more than my lawyer has been able to gather in 3 days of active investigation with resources. This is the beginning of a case. It's useful after 10 years. Corporate fraud offenses have long statutes of limitations in Mexico, and if the scheme continued, which it did, because what you saw 10 years ago was the beginning of something that continued to operate until last week, then the statute runs from the last fraudulent transaction, not the first. Rodrigo opened the folder again. This is the origin. The origin proves systematic intent, and that changes the entire weight of the case. Marisol nodded slowly. And Esteban is already in another country, the Cayman Islands, according to my lawyer, but he left with documentation under his middle name. There are extradition treaties. It's not impossible. And Valentina. Rodrigo took another second to respond to that name. Valentina is still in Mexico. She probably thought the folder was small enough that there wouldn't be a case. She looked at the documents. She was wrong. The silence that followed wasn't an empty silence. It was the silence of 2 people sitting before something that matters, that weighs, that will have consequences, that doesn't yet have form, but that can already be felt in the air of the small apartment with the damp stain in the corner and children's drawings on the walls. Is there anything else? Marisol said. Rodrigo looked up. She hesitated. It was the first time all week that Rodrigo had seen her doubt, and that alone was enough to tell him that what was coming was different from everything before. That night, Marisol said, when I copied the documents and took them out from under the oranges, I didn't leave the building alone. There was a security guard on the ground floor who always opened the gate for me. At 6 p.m., an older man, Don Aurelio, who had been in the building for 15 years and whom everyone ignored because he was part of the furniture, like me. A pause. Don Aurelio saw me leave that afternoon with the bag, and he saw my face. And without me saying anything, without me explaining absolutely anything, he told me, "Good luck, Miss Marisol, and keep safe what you are carrying." Rodrigo looked at her. He knew he saw everything, like all of us who are invisible in a building. It's just that no one asks us, because no one thinks it's worth asking. A pause. Don Aurelio died 6 years ago, of a heart attack. But before he died, he left me an envelope through his daughter. Inside was a USB drive with the files he had been copying over the years from the security booth computer, which recorded all access to the building, all visitors, all entry and exit times for each person. Rodrigo felt something physically perceptible, a kind of slow electricity traveling along his shoulders. "Do you have that drive? It's in the folder, in the inner pocket, taped with brown packing tape." Rodrigo opened the inner pocket of the folder. There it was, a small, gray USB drive, from about 15 years ago, with a paper label written by an old man's hand that simply said, "In case it's useful someday." Ah, he held it in his palm. Don Aurelio, a security guard no one saw, who for years had silently recorded everything that happened in that building, who had recognized in a young woman with a bag of oranges someone who was doing the right thing, and who had decided, without anyone asking him, to do his part. "Do you know what's on this drive?" Rodrigo asked. "I opened it once years ago when I got it. I saw access logs, names, dates, times. I didn't fully understand what it meant without context, but I saw Esteban Fuerte's name at times that didn't correspond to his official work hours. And I saw Valentina's name, Anturiaga, before she was Castellanos, when she still used her maiden name, in 2 visitor logs from 12 years ago. The weight of that fell onto the table between them, with the silent gravity of something that takes time to fall, but when it falls completely. Valentina and Esteban. 12 years ago, before she married Rodrigo, before Rodrigo probably even knew her, which meant that when Valentina entered Rodrigo Castellanos' life, Esteban Fuerte was already in Valentina's life, which meant that the marriage, the 14 years, the dinners with ministers, the paintings on the walls of the penthouse, the Chanel No. 5 perfume, had been part of the plan from the beginning. Rodrigo placed the drive carefully on the table. Marisol watched him. "Is it okay?" he asked, his voice low, like someone asking a real question, not a perfunctory one. "No," he said, "but I'm going to be." And it was the first time since Valentina had closed the door that Rodrigo Castellanos had said it and believed it at the same time. The evidence. Carlos Mendeville arrived at apartment 3B at 11 a.m. the next day, with a black leather briefcase, 3-day-old dark circles under his eyes, and the coffee he had bought at the corner OXXO, still in his hand, because he hadn't had time to drink it. He was a slender man of 51, with thin-rimmed glasses, and that kind of composure only lawyers possess, those who have seen many difficult things and learned that serenity is part of the job. Rodrigo was waiting for him at the door, and the two embraced briefly, with the restraint of men who have known each other for 30 years and know exactly how long a moment of humanity lasts before one has to get down to business. Marisol welcomed them, put real coffee on the table, not the corner store kind, which Carlos left unfinished with visible relief, and sat in the corner chair without anyone telling her to, because it was her table and her home, and because what was about to be discussed included her in a way that no one present pretended it didn't. Carlos opened the navy blue folder. The silence that followed as he reviewed it had the peculiar density of lawyers' silence when they read, a concentration that excludes everything else, which is not rudeness, but absolute focus. He flipped through pages, held invoices up to the light, read printed emails twice each. He took the USB drive and plugged it into his laptop with the care of someone handling evidence, because that's technically what it was. And he reviewed the files with the same methodical attention. No one spoke for 22 minutes. When Carlos looked up, his expression was that of someone who has found something they didn't expect to find, and is internally recalibrating the magnitude of the problem and the solution. "Where did you get this?" he asked Rodrigo. "I didn't get it," Rodrigo said. "Marisol had it." Carlos looked at Marisol for the first time with the real attention he had paid to the folder. He studied her the way lawyers study witnesses, looking for consistency, credibility, the solidity of what they are seeing. "You worked at the Castellanos group, cleaning, morning shift, 5th to 10th floor, for 8 months, 10 years, and some months ago, and you copied these documents during that time." "Yes, why?" "Because they didn't add up, and because someone had to notice." Carlos looked at her for another second, then nodded with the slowness of someone who has just made an important decision. "You're going to need to testify," he said. "At some point in the process, everything you saw and how you saw it will have to be said before a judge." "I know," Marisol said, not a muscle in her face moving. "I'm willing. Why do you think I kept it for 10 years? Carlos Mendeville, who in 30 years of practice had seen key witnesses break under far less pressure than this case was going to generate, looked at her for another moment and then returned to the documents. "All right," he said, "let's begin." They worked for 8 straight hours, Carlos, on the laptop, building the map of the fraudulent structure from Marisol's documents and cross-referencing them with what his team had gathered in the previous days. Rodrigo beside him, contributing his insider knowledge of the company, the names, the processes, the dates of contracts he himself had signed, without knowing they were part of the scaffolding. And Marisol, of whom no one would have expected to be the most useful person in the room, answering questions with surgical precision about details that neither Carlos nor Rodrigo could know, because they were details of what happens in a corporate building when no one important is looking. "This third-quarter invoice supplier," Carlos said at one point, pointing to the screen, "do you know if they had a physical presence in the building? Did you ever see anyone representing them?" Marisol thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Once, a man with a gray briefcase who arrived on a Tuesday in October, without an appointment, and went directly to the 10th floor without going through reception. Don Aurelio logged him in, because that was his protocol, even if the people upstairs told him it wasn't necessary." Pause. "The name he gave in the log was Fuentes, which is also my last name, which is why I remembered it. Different from mine, but the same surname." Carlos typed, opened the USB drive, searched the access logs by date and surname, and found it in 40 seconds. Fuentes Larralde, Gerardo. Tuesday, October 14th, 10 years and 4 months ago. Direct access to the 10th floor. Authorized by E. Fuerte. Carlos looked up. Gerardo Fuentes Larralde is the legal representative of 3 of the shell companies Esteban used to move money. He's his brother-in-law. The silence was brief, but absolute. "It all connects," Rodrigo said quietly. "It all connects," Carlos confirmed. "And most importantly, it connects backward. What Marisol saw 10 years ago is not an isolated antecedent. It's the documented origin of a scheme that continued to operate for a decade. That means the fraud hasn't expired because it never stopped." He half closed the laptop and looked at Rodrigo. "This is recoverable, Rodrigo. Not everything, not immediately, and it's not going to be easy, but there's a case. There's a real case." Rodrigo said nothing, rested his elbows on the table, and stared at the navy blue folder with an expression that Marisol, from her corner chair, identified without difficulty. It was the expression of someone who has been falling for days and has just felt something firm beneath their feet. "What do we need now?" Rodrigo asked. 3 things. Carlos raised a finger. "First, a criminal lawyer specializing in corporate crimes. I'm civil and commercial. This has gone beyond my area. I know someone, Licenciada Fuentes Garza. No relation to the Fuentes from the log," he clarified with a bit of dry irony, "who is the best at this and owes me a favor. I'll call her today." Second finger. "We need Marisol's documents to be authenticated by an expert, so their value as evidence is unassailable before a judge. I'll coordinate that." Third finger. "And we need protection for Marisol." The atmosphere in the apartment changed with that last word. "Protection?" Marisol asked, not alarmed, but attentive. "When Esteban and Valentina realize there's a case being built, and they will realize it because they have lawyers who monitor these movements, they'll want to know where the evidence is coming from, and at some point they'll come for you." Carlos looked at her directly. "I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you so we're prepared before it happens." Marisol processed that with the same calm with which she processed everything, and Camila asked, That's why I need to know if there's anywhere you can be while the process moves forward, somewhere discreet. Marisol looked at Rodrigo. Rodrigo looked at her. There are options, he said. We'll figure it out. Carlos made the call to Licenciada Fuentes Garza from the apartment, with the phone on speaker so Rodrigo could hear. She was a woman with a deep, direct voice who listened to the case summary in 6 minutes without interruption, and at the end said, "Send me the scanned documents this afternoon. Tomorrow at 9 we have a meeting, and tell your client not to speak to any media until I say so. None. Understood?" Carlos said. "There's an eyewitness with direct access to the operation in the initial period." Carlos looked at Marisol. "Yes," she said, "and he's solid." A brief pause on the other end of the line. "Even better," said the lawyer, and hung up. It was that afternoon, while Carlos was scanning documents and Marisol was preparing the cart for the evening. Because the cart didn't stop, life didn't stop. There were tamales to make, and atole to heat, and 4 neighborhoods to cover. And that didn't change, because the world of others was in upheaval. When Rodrigo peeked into the kitchen and found her working with that efficiency of hers that never waned, Marisol said, "Say, there's something I want to ask you, and I don't quite know how to ask." She put down the knife on the board and turned to look at him. Because when someone says they don't know how to ask something, the right thing to do is to look them in the face while they try. "Why did you keep all this for 10 years? Rodrigo asked. "Not for the case, not for strategy. Why did you, who had your own world to sustain, continue carrying this?" Marisol took a moment to answer. Not because she didn't know the answer. She knew it perfectly well for a long time, but because it was an answer she had never said aloud, and by saying it, it would become real in a different way. "Because I saw how the world works when people with power decide the rules don't apply to them," she said, her voice calm and uninflected. "I saw it in what happened to my father on the construction site. I saw it when they silenced me. I saw it in every person I know who has worked their whole life. And one day someone with more money or more connections comes along and tells them that what they built is worthless and to leave." A pause, and she thought that if she ever held something in her hand that could change, even a piece of it, she had no right to throw it away. Rodrigo looked at her for a long moment. He thought she was going to use it someday. "Honestly," Marisol said, "not always. There were years when I thought it was just paper stored under the bed, and that's where it would stay, but I kept it just the same." She returned to the knife and the board. The things one keeps on principle, even if one doesn't know for what purpose, almost always end up serving some purpose. Rodrigo remained in the kitchen doorway, looking at the drawings on the living room walls, the sunflower tablecloth, the shelf with the Virgin of Guadalupe and Camila's notebooks, and the second-hand novels and the little lights from the cart that Marisol had plugged into the wall outlet to recharge. He thought of the white marble penthouse, of the paintings by artists he had bought in galleries, because his image consultant said a man of his position should have them at dinners with ministers, where everything was discussed except what mattered. In 14 years of a life that had been, at its core, a very expensive facade with nothing real behind it. And he thought of this apartment with a damp stain in the corner, and a dripping faucet, and a creaky burgundy sofa, and drawings made by an 8-year-old girl who braided her own hair, and ate breakfast while doing multiplications, and who had told him with the honesty, without cruelty, that only children possess, that he had a face that suggested something very bad had happened. Marisol said, "When this is over, when the process advances and there's a result, I want to talk to you about something." "About what?" "About what comes next for the two of us." A pause. "But that's for when it's over. Now we have to finish." Marisol looked at him for a moment, then nodded once, and returned to her tamales. And in the living room, Carlos Mendeville was finishing scanning the last document from the navy blue folder, while outside the city continued to be the noisy, contradictory city, full of people who didn't know what was happening in a third-floor apartment on an unimportant street. And the battle that had been waiting in a drawer under a bed behind a shoebox for 10 years was finally beginning to storm. The first warning came without a warning. It was a Tuesday at 6 in the morning, 3 days after the meeting with Carlos and Licenciada Fuentes Garza, when Marisol went down to get the chained cart on the ground floor and found that the little yellow lights had been ripped off. Not one, all of them. The chain on the lock was intact, the cart in place, but someone had run their fingers over each of the wooden clip hooks and removed each little light with the patience of someone who wants to leave a message without leaving a trace. Marisol stood in front of the cart for a moment. She counted what was missing. 17 little lights. Then she went up to the apartment, told Rodrigo what she had found, and started preparing Camila's breakfast as if nothing had happened, because Camila was in the bedroom finishing getting dressed, and Marisol had learned long ago that the fears one shows in front of their children are the fears the children carry for the rest of their lives. "It's a warning," Rodrigo said softly. "I know," Marisol replied, just as quietly, her hands still on the comal. "Do they know we're moving something, or do they suspect? There's a difference." She flipped the tortilla with her fingers, fast, without burning herself. The ingrained skill of years. If they knew for sure, they wouldn't be little lights, they'd be something else. Rodrigo looked at her. She was right. It was a feeler, not a direct action. Someone sending a signal to see how they'd react. "I'm going to call Carlos," he said. "Wait until Camila leaves for school." Camila left at 8:10, her green dinosaur backpack, her asymmetrical braids, and her math notebook tucked under her arm, and before she went downstairs, she paused at the door and looked at Rodrigo with that unfiltered intensity of hers. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," Rodrigo said. Camila held his gaze a second longer than necessary for a satisfactory answer, and then looked at her mother. "Is something wrong?" she repeated, this time to Marisol. "Nothing that can't be handled," Marisol said. "Go on, you'll be late." Camila went downstairs. Marisol waited for the sound of the downstairs entryway gate before releasing the breath she'd been holding. Carlos Mendivil arrived that same day with Licenciada Fuentes Garza, who in person was exactly like her voice. Direct, unadorned, with a folder under her arm and an expression that conveyed she'd seen more complicated things than plucked little lights, and that this wasn't the time to waste on unnecessary alarms. "The little lights could be a coincidence or pressure," she said, sitting in the corner chair that Marisol had already claimed as her own. This implied Marisol had sat in the other chair, which in turn implied that apartment 3B had, without anyone formally declaring it, become the headquarters for something that didn't yet have a name, but did have direction. In any case, we're changing the timeline. I'm filing the criminal complaint this week, ahead of schedule, because once the process is formally open, the level of legal protection increases significantly. She looked at Marisol. "The documents are authenticated. The expert finishes tomorrow," Carlos said. "Good. As soon as you have the report, send it to me. And I need you to make sure Rodrigo is available to testify Thursday afternoon. We're going to build the complaint in 2 layers. First, corporate fraud, which is the most documented, and on top of that, collusion. Valentina's name comes in on the second layer, with the digital signature and the memory records." "And Esteban?" Rodrigo asked. "Esteban is Interpol's problem and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs', and I've already made the right calls." A brief pause. "I have a contact at the Financial Intelligence Unit who's been tracking capital movements to that destination for 2 years. Esteban's situation isn't an isolated case. He's on a bigger radar than ours, which for us is an advantage because it means state resources are already invested in this and will be added to the case the moment we formalize it." Unquote. The apartment was silent, save for the drip of the still unrepaired faucet. "How long will the process take?" Marisol asked. The licenciada looked at her with clear respect, the kind of respect that doesn't need to be stated, but is visible in the quality of her attention. "Corporate criminal proceedings in Mexico take between 1 and 3 years on average before sentencing," she said, without softening. "There are ways to expedite, there are ways things get bogged down. I won't promise what I can't guarantee. What I can tell you is that the evidence you've kept makes this case unusually solid for what we normally see in this area." Marisol nodded. "I need to do something different these days with Camila, with the cart, with my routine. For now, everything the same. Normalcy is your best protection because it shows there's nothing to hide." The licenciada gathered her folder. "But if anything else happens, anything at all, no matter how small it seems, call me immediately. Don't you evaluate whether it's important or not? You call me, and I'll evaluate." The second warning arrived 4 days later, and this one was not small. Marisol went out at 10 p.m. with the cart toward the first neighborhood on her route. Rodrigo went with her, as he had every night since the first. Blue apron, squeaky wheels, broken ramps. It was a night without rain, the city sky showing that low orange hue that nights have when clouds hold the light from the buildings, and the route progressed with the normalcy of things repeated until they become rituals. It was on the way back, around 1:40 a.m., when they turned the corner toward the building, that they saw the spare cart, the older one, the one Marisol kept in the building's inner courtyard in case the main one needed repairs. It was overturned, its trays crushed, the burner bent as if by something heavy, its steel structure twisted in a way that doesn't happen by accident, but by deliberate, sustained force. And on the wreckage, written in black marker on the cement floor of the courtyard, was a phrase, "Those who don't know how to shut up, learn to do so." Rodrigo read the phrase and felt something that wasn't fear. He had processed fear in the first few days, when he understood the magnitude of what Esteban and Valentina had been capable of. This was something colder and more concrete, confirmation that the other side had moved from probing to direct pressure, and that meant something they were moving through legal channels had reached their ears, which also meant the case was real enough for them to be afraid. Paradoxically, that was good news, but what mattered at that moment wasn't strategic analysis. What mattered was Camila. Rodrigo looked at Marisol. She already had her phone in her hand. "Camila is with my neighbor in 2A, she said, answering the question before he asked it. "I asked her to stay there tonight because I had a feeling." A pause. "I'll go get her now, Marisol." "I'm fine," she said, and she meant it, in the way people say it, who have learned to separate what they feel from what they need to do. She was fine in the sense of functional, operational, capable of taking the next step, even if her heart was pounding. "Call the licenciada. I'll go for Camila." Rodrigo called Licenciada Fuentes Garza, while Marisol went up to the second floor. The lawyer answered on the third ring with a voice that wasn't of someone who had just woken up, but of someone who had been expecting that call. "What happened?" Rodrigo described what they had found. The licenciada listened without interrupting. "Photos of everything," she said when he finished. "Every angle, including the phrase on the floor. Don't touch anything. I'm going to call a contact at the prosecutor's office right now to have them file a report tonight." Pause. "The girl is fine. Yes, she was with a neighbor. Good. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. at my office, the three of you. And Rodrigo, this is good, even if it doesn't seem like it." "I know," he said. "They know because they're afraid. And they're afraid because the case is reaching them." Camila saw the destroyed cart because Marisol couldn't prevent it. The inner courtyard was the required path to the stairs, and the girl passed in front of the wreckage before Marisol could get in her way. She stopped, looked at it, looked at the phrase on the floor. Then she looked at her mother with those direct eyes she had, and at that moment, they weren't the eyes of a frightened child, but the eyes of a child processing information with the seriousness of someone who has grown up in a world where difficult things aren't hidden but explained. "Did they do it because we have the things from the folder?" Marisol asked. She looked at her. "How do you know about the folder?" she asked. "Because I saw you take it out from under the bed, and because I heard a little, without apparent guilt. Not everything, but enough to understand that there are bad people who don't want Daddy to." She corrected herself. "For Mr. Rodrigo to get his back." Rodrigo was behind Marisol and heard that. The half-corrected Daddy registered, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say that wasn't too much for that moment. "Yes," Marisol said, with direct honesty. "That's why. And they're gonna get it back anyway. We're gonna try." Camila looked at the destroyed cart one more time. Then she looked at Rodrigo. "Are you scared?" she asked. "A little," he said with the same honesty. "My mom says fear is a sign that something matters." She took Marisol's hand. "Then it matters a lot." And she went up the stairs with her dinosaur backpack, leaving the two adults in the courtyard, facing the remains of the old cart, under the city's orange night sky, without saying anything, because enough had already been said. The week that followed was the most difficult since the beginning of everything. Corporate gossip portals, fed, Carlos later learned, by a publicist hired specifically for that purpose, began publishing stories about Rodrigo, mixing real facts with insinuations designed to tarnish. They claimed the collapse of the Castellanos group wasn't external fraud but internal mismanagement, that Rodrigo had known about the irregularities for years and ignored them for convenience, that government contracts had inflated prices that he had personally approved. Valentina gave an interview to an anonymous social magazine, attributed to sources close to the family, in which she described a marriage where she had silently suffered her husband's irresponsible decisions for years. The interview was accompanied by photos of Valentina on a terrace overlooking the sea, impeccable, serene, with the kind of smile that comes from knowing you'll come out of the photograph looking good. Rodrigo saw it on his phone, with the cart, between the second and third neighborhoods of the night route. He closed it without comment. "Did you see it?" Marisol asked, who always noticed when he looked at the screen with that expression. "Yes." And Rodrigo thought for a moment. What exactly would someone do who knows they're going to lose in court and needs to win elsewhere? He put the phone away. The licenciata told me this would happen. That before the case reached the courts, they would try to destroy me in public so the judge would enter the process with a pre-formed image. And it works sometimes with certain judges in certain contexts. A pause. But Licenciata Fuentes Garza chose the court carefully, and the documents in her folder aren't contaminated by any magazine interview. Marisol pushed the cart uphill on the worst ramp of the route, the one in the market alley, without asking for help, although Rodrigo was beside her and could have. "You know what bothers me the most?" she said, without losing her rhythm. "Not the interview, not the broken cart, not the little lights. What bothers me most is that they've been doing this for years, using the system, using money, using connections, and that for those years, there were people like my father, like Don Aurelio, like me, who paid the price for what they took, without names, without news, without anyone writing an interview about us." Rodrigo listened to her. "That's why it matters that this goes all the way," he said. "Yes," Marisol said, "that's why." They reached the flat, and the cart's wheels stopped squeaking with effort, returning to their normal sound. That sound that Rodrigo now also knew, that he would recognize anywhere. Marisol said, "Tell me, when this is over, you said it once." "I'm going to keep saying it until it happens." She didn't answer. But in the darkness of the street, under the city's orange sky, which never quite gets completely dark, Rodrigo thought he saw on Marisol's profile, as she pushed her cart toward the next neighborhood, something that resembled a small, guarded smile, and that was enough to keep walking. The trial. The 17th District Criminal Court was a 4-story gray building in the historic center, smelling of machine coffee, printed paper, and that peculiar sense of suspended time found in places where important things happen without haste or fanfare. The second-floor courtroom had tall, leaded glass windows that filtered light into oblique stripes across the dark wood chairs and a raised dais. Presiding was Judge Licenciado Herrera Montoya, 62 years old, 28 years on the bench, a face that had seen it all and was not easily impressed. He moved with the economy of gestures of someone who knew his presence alone declared authority. Rodrigo arrived with Licenciada Fuentes Garza and Carlos Mendivil at 8:45 a.m. The hearing was at 9. The courtroom was already filling up. Valentina's legal team, 4 lawyers in expensive suits, their briefcases perfectly organized, and journalists in the public seating. 2 held notepads. The others had phones ready to record, within the bounds of what the law permitted. Valentina arrived at 9:02 a.m. Rodrigo hadn't seen her since the night she'd closed the door of the penthouse. She entered the room with her usual confident stride, her hair pulled back in a flawlessly executed chignon, a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, and that structured calm he had interpreted for 14 years as serenity. Now, with the knowing eye of someone who understood what lay beneath, he recognized it for what it truly was, the deliberate control of someone who needed to hide what was inside. Their eyes met for a second. Valentina didn't blink. Neither did Rodrigo. Then, they both looked forward, toward the bench, where Judge Herrera Montoya began to arrange his papers with precise, unhurried movements. The first 3 hours of the hearing were technical and dense. Presentation of evidence. Defense objections. The Licenciada Fuentes Garza's rebuttals. The judge's interventions with seemingly neutral questions. But Rodrigo, throughout the morning, learned to read them, to understand how this 62-year-old man was publicly constructing his grasp of the case. Valentina's team was good. Rodrigo admitted it to himself without hesitation. Failing to do so would have been underestimating the problem. They questioned the chain of custody of Marisol's documents. They questioned the legal validity of a USB drive handed over by a deceased security guard through his daughter. They questioned the accounting interpretation of the invoices, arguing that without the full context of the corporate books that had disappeared with Esteban, the partial documents could be interpreted in multiple ways. These were solid arguments, precisely the ones Licenciada Fuentes Garza had anticipated during weeks of preparation, and she had a response for each. The chain of custody was impeccable because the certified expert had worked on the originals under controlled conditions, and the report was unassailable. The USB drive had been authenticated by a forensic computer expert who confirmed the files had not been modified since their original creation. And the accounting interpretation of the invoices did not require the complete books to be valid. Marisol's documents established not an accounting conclusion, but a pattern of behavior. Repeated vendors, identical amounts in irregular periods, beneficiaries that the Public Registry of Commerce directly linked to Esteban Fuerte and his brother-in-law, something any judge experienced in corporate crime could readily discern without needing an accounting degree. The moment Rodrigo had been waiting for, without quite knowing he was waiting for it, arrived at 12:40 p.m. Valentina's lead attorney, a man in his 50s with a radio-smooth voice and the confidence of someone who had won many difficult cases, asked for the floor. "With all due respect to this court," he said, his modulation perfect, "the case presented today rests fundamentally on the testimony and documents of an individual without professional training in accounting, lacking hierarchy within the company, whose supposed irregular operation went unnoticed, and without any verifiable incentive to have kept information for 10 years. Except," and here he paused, "a calculated beat. That which might derive from a personal relationship with the complainant, the exact nature of which this court should consider with care." The insinuation hung in the air. Rodrigo felt something stir in his chest. Not anger, not yet. Licenciada Fuentes Garza waited just long enough for the insinuation to fully register with the judge, then rose with the calm of someone who had spent 3 decades anticipating this very move. "With the court's permission," she began, "the witness Marisol Fuentes' training includes accounting studies. Though her studies were not concluded due to circumstances beyond her control, circumstances that precisely include her illegal dismissal from the complainant's company when she reported the very irregularities now before this court, they are sufficient to support her recognition of the documented patterns. However," and here the licenciada raised a finger with a delicacy that was pure steel, "the court need not evaluate Mrs. Fuentes' training to validate the evidence she preserved, because that evidence has been attested to by certified experts whose competence is not in question. Mrs. Fuentes is not the case. The case is the documents, and documents have no academic training nor personal relationships. Documents simply are." Silence filled the room. Judge Herrera Montoya scribbled in his notebook. Valentina's lawyer attempted to respond. The judge stopped him with a slight gesture of his hand. "The objection is noted, and will be considered in the final assessment," the judge said. His neutrality in that moment, the most beautiful thing Rodrigo had ever heard. Rodrigo's testimony began at 1:20 p.m. He sat on the witness stand, facing the courtroom, and looked at Valentina for the first time since she had arrived. She was looking back at him from her seat, her structured calm undisturbed throughout the morning. The defense attorney asked his questions. Rodrigo answered everything with the dry precision of someone who had prepared every response with his lawyer for weeks, knowing exactly what to say and what not to say, because deviating from the correct context would cost him more than it would gain. It was at the end, when Licenciada Fuentes Garza posed her questions as the prosecution, that the moment occurred which no one in that room, except perhaps the licenciada who had planned it, expected. "Mr. Castellanos," the licenciada said, "can you explain to the court what it means to you that the first person to detect and document the fraudulent scheme that destroyed your company was a cleaning employee, someone no one asked, no one believed, and whom the perpetrator of that scheme fired precisely to silence her?" The defense attorney stood to object. The judge let him speak, then ruled the question admissible, as it pertained to the context of harm suffered by third parties within the framework of the case. Rodrigo took a second. He looked around the room, the journalists with their notepads, the lawyers with their briefcases, the judge with his notebook. And in the back, because the licenciada had specifically requested it, and the judge had allowed it, sat Marisol Fuentes, in the last row, wearing a green blouse, her hair pulled back, her hands clasped over the bag she always carried. Rodrigo looked at her for a moment. She looked back, directly, without blinking, her large eyes devoid of filter or protocol. "It means," Rodrigo said, his voice no longer that of a corporate executive, nor the defeated man from the park bench, but something between the two, and calmer than either, that the system that stole everything from me also tried to steal from her, and that she, without resources, without hierarchy, without anyone backing her, did the right thing anyway. She kept the evidence for 10 years because she believed the truth was more important than the comfort of forgetting. I lost a company. She lost her job, her security, years of her life that could have been different if someone had listened to her at the time. What she did required a kind of courage that I, with all my resources, all my connections, lacked the capacity to recognize until I had nothing left, and she was the only one still standing. Quite. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Herrera Montoya wrote at length in his notebook. Rodrigo did not look at Valentina. It was no longer necessary. The verdict did not come that day. Verdicts in corporate criminal proceedings are not rendered on the same day as testimonies, and Licenciada Fuentes Garza had explained this clearly from the outset. The process had stages, deadlines, possible appeals. What did arrive that week, 4 days after the hearing, was a precautionary measure issued by Judge Herrera Montoya before the final verdict. The measure froze all assets registered in the names of Valentina and Rodrigo de Castellanos, and the companies linked to her, as the ultimate beneficiary, including the Tulum property. It prohibited her from leaving the country, and formally notified the financial authorities of the Cayman Islands, under the Treaty of Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters, of the request for the location and patrimonial information of Eduardo Gerardo Fuerteblanco, Esteban with his middle name, for crimes of fraud, tax evasion, and criminal association. Carlos Mendibile called Rodrigo to inform him of the measure at 6 p.m., his voice for the first time in weeks carrying a note of something other than tension. "It's not the verdict," Carlos said, "but it's the judge telling the world the case has enough weight to take action before it's resolved. A judge doesn't do that with a case that's not going to prosper." How long until the sentence? Months? Probably between 6 and 9. A pause. But Rodrigo, the path is clear. What Marisol kept under her bed for 10 years, plus what Don Aurelio left on that memory stick, plus what my team has reconstructed of the financial structure, forms a case that the defense won't be able to dismantle without costing them more than they're willing to spend. Rodrigo was in the kitchen of apartment 3B when he received the call. Marisol was preparing the cart for the evening, as she did every night, with her usual efficiency. Camila was doing homework at the table, her brow furrowed over a fractions problem that was giving her trouble. He hung up the phone. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. "Good news?" Marisol asked without turning. The judge issued precautionary measures. Marisol paused her hands for a second. Only a second. Then she continued. "That's good. That's very good." Camila looked up from her fractions. "Did we win already?" she asked. "Not yet," Rodrigo said. "But we're doing well. When will we win?" "A few months." Camila processed this with the seriousness of someone for whom a few months was a perfectly manageable amount of time. "Okay," she said, and returned to her fractions. And Marisol, her back still turned, adjusting the burner on the cart with a precise twist of her wrist, smiled in a way no one saw, because no one was looking that way except Rodrigo, who was. And he kept that smile somewhere inside, with the same care that Camila had drawn the sad man from the park. The new life. The verdict arrived on a Thursday in October, 8 months and 12 days after that rainy night in the park where Rodrigo Castellanos had sat on a wet bench with nowhere to go, and a woman with a tamale cart had appeared from between the lampposts like something fate had been patiently preparing for a decade. Licenciada Fuentes Garza called Rodrigo at 2 p.m., with a voice he'd never heard before, one he took a moment to identify. It was the voice of someone who had won something they deserved, and who felt the specific weight of that kind of victory. It wasn't the kind of win that comes from luck or position, but from truth proving mightier than the resources on the other side. "Guilty on all counts," she said, her voice clearing. "Corporate fraud, criminal conspiracy, tax evasion. Valentina Iturriaga, guilty of collusion and digital signature misuse." An order was issued for the return of the Castellanos Group's recoverable assets, including contracts, real estate within the country, and linked accounts. A pause. And Rodrigo Esteban Fuerte was arrested in the Cayman Islands this morning. Extradition is in process. Rodrigo stood in the room he now occupied in apartment 3B. Marisol had given him the bedroom, sleeping on the plum-colored sofa herself. He'd been trying to invest for months without success, because Marisol had an advantage over him. In her home, she made the decisions. He heard the verdict while standing by the blue-checkered window, the city outside, the same as always, and inside, a feeling that couldn't quite fit in his chest. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," the licenciada replied. "Thank Mrs. Fuentes. Without her file, without Don Aurelio, without 10 years of holding on to what no one asked her to keep, this case would have been very difficult." A brief pause. "It's you, Rodrigo, but she is the story." He told Marisol that night when they returned from their rounds with the cart. There was no solemn way to say it, nor would Marisol have wanted there to be. He told her in the kitchen while she put the leftover atole in the refrigerator, and he took off the navy blue apron he still wore every night. No one had said it was no longer necessary, and at some point, It had stopped being a gesture of solidarity and had become something that was simply part of the routine. Marisol heard it all. The verdict, the return of assets, Esteban's arrest. When he finished, she closed the refrigerator, leaned against the counter with her hands at her sides, and looked at the sunflower-patterned tablecloth for a moment. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Strange," Rodrigo admitted honestly. "I thought I'd feel more or something different. But it feels like when the rain stops, you go outside, and the ground is wet, the air smells different, and everything is still there. But everything is also new." Marisol nodded slowly. "That's because what you're recovering isn't the same as what you lost," she said. "What you lost was the Rodrigo from before. What you're recovering is for the Rodrigo of now, and you're not the same person." Rodrigo looked at her. He didn't say, "We're not the same person." The apartment was silent. Camila was asleep. The new little lights on the cart, replaced months ago, 17 of them, one by one, were off and tucked away in their bag. The kitchen faucet had stopped dripping 3 weeks prior, when Rodrigo, tired of waiting for the plumber, had watched a video on his phone and fixed it himself with a wrench and 40 minutes of patience. "Marisol," Rodrigo said. "I know what you're going to say," she replied. "Yes. That you want to talk about what comes next." "Yes. And if I don't want to talk yet, then I'll wait." She looked at him. Those direct, unfiltered eyes that in 8 months, Rodrigo had learned to read, with the precision of someone studying a language, until they stop translating and start thinking directly in it. "It's not that I don't want to," Marisol said carefully, choosing her words with the honesty she always chose. "It's that there are things I need to understand. First, you're going to get your company back, your money, your name. You'll go back to being Rodrigo Castellanos, and I'll still be the woman with the cart in the park. That's not what—" "Let me finish." It wasn't brusqueness, but the voice of someone who had thought deeply about something and needed to say it all before being interrupted. "I'm not saying it as a complaint. I'm saying it because I'm honest, and honesty is the only thing that makes things last. I am this person, this apartment, this cart, this life. I'm not ashamed of it, but I also don't want anyone to enter my life, because it looks pretty from the outside. And then, when the novelty wears off, it turns out the prettiness was the distance, not the thing itself." The silence that followed was long. Rodrigo thought about it. He truly thought about it, not with the haste of someone trying to quell a worry, but with the seriousness it deserved when someone tells you something true. "I've been in this apartment for 8 months, he finally said. "I've pushed that cart through 4 neighborhoods in the rain and the cold, and on nights when my whole body begged me to stop. I've eaten toast with beans for breakfast, and I've fixed your kitchen faucet, and I've listened to Camila explain fractions to me with a patience I never had for anyone." A pause. "I'm not looking from the outside. I've been inside for 8 months. And if there's one thing I know with more certainty than anything I've ever known in my life, as an executive, a man of money, a person who thought he knew how the world worked, it's that inside is where I want to be." Marisol looked at him for a long moment. "Even when you get everything back?" she asked. "Even then. Especially then. Because getting everything back without this makes no sense, and I no longer do things that don't make sense." Another, shorter silence. "There's something I want to propose," Rodrigo said. "And it's not what you're thinking." Marisol raised her eyebrows slightly. "When the Castellanos group is reconstituted," he began, in the voice of a man thinking as he speaks, building an idea in real time, "it will need a financial director. Someone I won't be able to fill alone, because I still don't trust my own judgment to choose the right people. I've spent weeks thinking about who I'd want in that position." He looked at her directly. "You detected a corporate fraud scheme with 3 semesters of accounting and 8 months of cleaning floors. With real access to the books, with full training, with the resources a financial director deserves. I don't even want to imagine what you'd be capable of seeing." Marisol opened her mouth, then closed it. "I don't have a degree," she said. "Degrees are given by time and money. Judgment comes from something else." Rodrigo didn't look away. "There are universities with executive night programs for people who couldn't finish at the right time. I've researched it for 2 years. Marisol Fuentes, certified public accountant, financial director of the Castellanos Group." A pause. "If you want." The silence in apartment 3B at that moment had a quality neither of them could have described precisely, but both felt. It was the silence of something arriving after a long wait, and when it arrives, it doesn't have the sound one imagined, but something quieter. more real, and more lasting. I'd have to think about it, Marisol said. I know you will. That's why I'm telling you now. And I don't expect an answer now. And Camila has already explained fractions to me twice. I'm good at math. Marisol let out something that was a laugh, brief, genuine, the kind that escapes without permission. And that was enough to change the air in the apartment, just as the air changes when the rain stops. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday at 7 p.m., Rodrigo installed the last of the new little lights on the cart. This time, he secured them with stronger clips, not wood, but stainless steel, because he'd researched which kind held up better to moisture. And Marisol watched him from the building entrance, arms crossed, with that expression of someone evaluating another's work without saying if it's right or wrong until it's finished. When he stood up and switched on the strip, the 17 yellow lights flickered together and then stabilized, brighter than the previous ones, because the new strip had better insulation. How did it turn out? Rodrigo asked. Marisol looked at them for a moment. Good, she said. And in Marisol's mouth, good was exactly the same as perfect, but without the affectation. Camila appeared at the door next to her mother, her drawing notebook under her arm. For the past 2 months, she'd been filling notebooks with a speed that necessitated regular purchases of new ones. She looked at the lit-up lights, with the same serious evaluation she applied to everything. It's better than the others, she declared. That's what I say, Rodrigo replied. Shall we go out? Camila asked. Let's go out, Marisol said, and the three of them stepped out into the night. Rodrigo pushing the cart, its wheels squeaking on the ramps and falling silent on the flat. Marisol setting the pace and the route, with the calm authority of someone who knows her territory. And Camila between them, notebook under her arm, and eyes wide open to the city at night, mentally sketching what she would later transfer to paper in her large, round handwriting, which she still hadn't decided whether to make smaller or leave the same, because she liked it that way. The little yellow lights blinked softly on the cart's steel. The atole steamed. The tamales waited, wrapped in corn husks with the patience of things that have been done well, and know someone will want them. And in some neighborhood of the city, on some park bench or at the threshold of a late-night shift, there were people waiting for something warm on a cold night. People who worked when no one was watching, who built things no one saw, who kept what was right to keep, even if no one asked them to. People like Marisol, people who, if one had the luck and humility to find them, could change one's entire life. 2 months later, Rodrigo asked Marisol a question next to the restored cart on the same corner where it all began, under a sky without rain, for the first time in many nights. It wasn't a question that required kneeling on the floor, or spectacular rings, or witnesses. It was the direct question of a man who has learned that important things are said as they are, without embellishments, because embellishments are for people who don't trust the weight of what they have. Marisol took exactly the time she needed to answer, which wasn't long, and Camila, who was drawing in her notebook leaning against the cart, looked up for a moment, assessed the situation with the unfiltered fixity of her just-turned 9 years, and returned to her drawing because she had known for a long time, since the night she had left on the plum-colored sofa, the drawing of a sad man sitting on a bench in the rain, and had known with the certainty, without explanation, that children possess for things adults are still trying to understand, that that sad man would not be sad forever, that he had come to stay. Yes,